You are now listening to the Hunter's Advantage podcast. We preserve the history and sport of hunting through curious conversation and action-packed hunts, as well as offering you tips and strategy for more successful hunts. Welcome to Deer Science Month.
The goal of this series is to break down the science behind the different senses of a white-tailed deer to make us better hunters.
We're going to be talking to some of the best deer biologists across the country about topics like deer vision, smell, hearing, taste, and we'll even throw in cool topics like, does culling deer actually work? The difference between CWD and EHD, and we'll talk about some GPS collar research. So anything you want to know about deer science and biology, hopefully we're going to cover it in this series. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hunter's Advantage podcast. Today I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Jake Gaylord, and a very special guest, Dr. Bronson Strickland. We appreciate you jumping on the podcast with us. Thank you so much for doing that.
Absolutely. Happy to join you, and I look forward to the conversation.
We're really excited to kick off this 4-week series that we're going through on the podcast called Deer Science Month. We thought you would be the perfect guest to kick off this series with us, talking about 5 deer science facts every hunter should know. But before we get too deep into that and kind of diving into those topics, can you give us a little bit of a background into maybe your education, your hunting experience, how you grew up doing that, and then kind of how you got to this place of working for MSU in the Deer Lab?
Yeah, I'll do my best to make this really brief, but I'm really lucky in that there was a career that fit me perfectly. So when I was young, I found out that there was this thing called deer biology and management. And I believe I was in 8th grade when I learned that. And I never looked back. I mean, I never, ever had any desire to even try to do anything else. If this didn't exist, I have no idea. I don't know. I might be nailing shingles on a house or whatever. So that really worked out for me. I got my undergraduate at the University of Georgia. And then I went to Texas A&M Kingsville and worked on my master's degree there. Then I moved to Mississippi State, first as an employee on a research project with Steve Damaris. That's how I met Steve, working for him. And that project eventually just turned into a PhD. So I was able to continue doing what I was doing and get my PhD. I then left for a couple of years and worked for USDA, the Department of Agriculture. And luckily, this position within the Extension Service opened up, and I was lucky enough to get that job. And where my position differs from Steve's, and we have really good synergy in terms of our job requirements and in terms of our personalities. Steve is the traditional, when you think of a professor, that's Steve. In terms of his teaching is in the classroom, he has graduate students, and he conducts research. Mine is more focused on outreach. And so it is the seminars and the popular articles. And nowadays that would be a podcast and a YouTube channel and social media. But my job literally is to take the research, the wildlife management research conducted at MSU and elsewhere, and get it to people with like the venue that we have now on this podcast. And then I also, Steve and I collaborate on the research. Almost every research project he's on, I'm on, and vice versa. So we just synergize really well together. And 2 brains are better than 1.
Well, sure. It kind of sounds like after you laid out your resume just now, I heard here recently you added a house mover on that as well.
That is a young person's game. I don't know if I have another one of those in me. That we downsized about a year ago, and so we got another house. We bought a house, and so for the past week, and you always underestimate. You think it'll take a couple of days, and it ended up taking more than a week. And if you know, I've got on a shirt, but inside here is tears and bruises, and I'm really beat up on the inside. I'm hurting.
That's funny. Well, so I know you said your passion for deer biology was kind of sparked in 8th grade. What was your hunting background? Was it out of a love of hunting or just a general interest for the wildlife?
Yeah, I would say a little bit of both. It was absolutely through hunting. And so I didn't really, and I'm going to show my age and show your youth with this, but you got to remember the generation before me, meaning my father, they didn't have deer to chase in the Southeast. I mean, I remember with him seeing the first deer track we saw. I mean, that was just when the effects of restocking throughout the Southeast was growing and the deer populations were growing. And I mean, I remember, deer season when we had doe day. It's hard to comprehend now, but there had to be just this one weekend, these 2 days that you could legally harvest a doe. I mean, that occurred when I was, a teenager. And so, yeah, that is really what fascinated me was deer hunting. And of course, bobwhite quail even then were abundant. So squirrel hunting, quail hunting, and then started deer hunting. And that's what really attracted me. It was big game and deer and just fascinated with it. And then I was always kind of the nature channel kind of kid. There's a lot of options now, but way back when, I don't know, I just always gravitated towards that. I was always fascinated by that. So when I found out that you could go to school to do something like that, I knew that was for me.
That's awesome. Well, let's talk about some of maybe your life's work here and your ultimate passion when we talk about deer science. I wanted to start here because this one always fascinates me. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what we've learned in the last decade or two in terms of buck movement with GPS collar research, just kind of a high level overview?
Yeah, I would guess what is, I guess, really fundamentally different about the GPS collars. Remember, before GPS collars, the more primitive tracking device was called VHF collars. And that stands for very high frequency. But all those pictures where you see a technician like me, which is what I did when I was a technician, is you climb up in the back of the truck and you've got this little receiver in one shoulder and you're holding an antenna, waving it around, and you're listening to the beep, 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 where you're getting the strongest signal from the beep. And then you're getting a compass bearing and you have to triangulate. So you need to get 3 or more positions. And then you go back with a map and you draw those bearings out and you triangulate where the animal was. And depending on the reception, you might be able to isolate that location into a 1/4 acre, or it might be 50 acres or more. So that really hadn't changed other than the logistics. But what is really different is that, and I remember this distinctly, is when you do your route, over 100 acres or 1,000 acres, and you're standing out and waving the wand, when you don't hear the beep, you have no idea where that deer is at. And so it may literally be over a hill or down, somewhere that's obstructing the signal, or it may be miles and miles away. So what researchers would do, 20 plus years ago, if you had the budget, is that, once a month or once every 6 months, you would hire a pilot. And then you would affix those antennas on the wing and you would get up and you would try to find your animals. And sometimes you could, sometimes you can't. So the biggest deal is that, minus the logistics, is that we know where these animals go, that they cannot go anywhere on the globe without us knowing where they're at. And so some of these movement bouts are just very, very different than we thought they were, even 10 plus years ago. I mean, to think that some of these excursions that take place, which just about every buck is going to have an excursion right before or during the rut, and these just extraordinary movements. We've got a couple that are 20 plus miles, but there was the one example out of Missouri, I believe. I saw that in Quality Whitetails. I think that buck did a one-way trip of over 100 miles. And no one has any explanation for that whatsoever.
Is that the one that crossed that river?
One of the bucks we have, and it's just fascinating. The second part, the distance is fascinating, but what really makes it cool that we just scratch our head is the timing. And to let you in on a little insight that how I've evolved over the years, I remember probably 10 years ago from hunters. I would get feedback from hunters that were religiously running their trail cameras. And they would say something, the email would say something like this. I've noticed that for 3 years in a row around, make up a date here, October 15th, we see this buck show up and then they're gone. They're here for a month or for 6 months or whatever, and then they're gone. And next October 15th, they're here again. Frankly, I thought there's no way that's occurring. That they're just on they're on the adjacent property and you're not getting photos of it, but it's still there. You're just missing it. And what we have learned is that hunters running those trail cameras were absolutely correct in what they were seeing and the timing of it. So with our example, he's called Buck 140, which that just means that was the number of the ear tag. It was in his ear. Is he would spend the fall and winter in Mississippi hunting season, and then he would swim the Mississippi River and spend the late spring and summer in Louisiana. And within about a week on either of those, when he would swim back and when he would leave Mississippi and go back to Louisiana, it was always within about a week. And we saw that for 2 years in a row. So he left Mississippi, swam the river, went to Louisiana, spent the summer there, came back, spent the winter in Mississippi, swam, he had 2 cycles of that. And it was, again, he would cross the river at approximately the same place and approximately the same time. So, and if you have an explanation for why he would want to do that, I'd love to hear it because we don't.
Jake had this here. Jake had this happen like in 2016, through like 2018. There was like one 8-point that would come by in early or mid-December. Like 1 or 2 days every single year within the same time period, he'd travel and we get one picture of him a year and then skirt out again. And it was like clockwork, like by the day, seemed like by the hour. And those excursions, learning about those are very cool. Do you have any explanation into why deer do that? Is it in seeking of does, or what's kind of their reasoning for excursions?
Yeah. And there's a lot of terminology there and it's kind of fuzzy. But movements like that are a continuum. And so we kind of frame it up, but kind of what we call an excursion is kind of like a weekend trip. And that's it's usually 1 to 2 days. Sometimes it's 3 days. And it's usually right before or during the rut. And that might be, it may just be 3 or 4 miles away. So think off your property and on the adjacent, and this depends on property size, but they're going to be on 1 or 2 or 3 properties over. So, some of these really radical movements, they're not for the weekend. It's usually for a longer period of time. So think months and think of, it might be 5, 10, 20 miles away. Now, for that, really don't know. There's some hypotheses floating around, like maybe it's the buck's natal range, meaning where he was born. And for some reason, he's going to go back during the summer and check that out. Some people, at least in our area, have thought, well, maybe it's food resources. Maybe because where he went, this particular buck went in Louisiana, it was around soybean fields. It was around agriculture. But where that doesn't work for us is he walked through agriculture to swim the river to get to agriculture. So that really doesn't pan out very well. So those types of movements, we really don't know. And sometimes we even think that, and again, this might sound kind of crazy, but there's just a small proportion of the population that are colonizers, that they're always looking for new areas. And think about, and for a human example, go back 300 or 400 years ago, it was in some people's blood to be explorers. Wouldn't be in mine. I'm not going to get on a ship and hope I come back or not. But know, but if you go and discover something, you come back and there's gold and riches and fame and all that kind of stuff. We just think that maybe deep within the genome, of deer and maybe other mammals, there's a certain fraction of the population that do just that. The more typical excursions make a lot of sense. So again, kind of the weekend trip, that makes a lot of sense just for breeding opportunities. Again, because most of them are occurring right before or during the rut. We think they're just, for example, it could be a buck. They've heat checked or scent checked, all the different matriarchal doe groups in their home range, and maybe they're just going to set out and go look. And the term for that is called prospecting. They're out prospecting and maybe looking for other opportunities. And maybe they might find an area that's not occupied by an older or more dominant buck, and maybe it's a place they can come back to. Nobody, though, guys, really knows. These are all just educated guesses as to what's going on.
Certain regions of, let's say, Oklahoma have different, I guess, peak rut stages. Like down in Southeast, it could be, around November 7th or 14th. And then up here Northeast where I live, typically it's around late November. So like in the 20s of November, you're good to go. Now, could that have any correlation with, let's say, that buck 140 that crossed through the Mississippi and stuff like that? Do they typically go through the excursions like around the rut? So therefore, when he crossed it, could that have possibly been the peak rut over there, and then came back to his home and rutted there as well, or vice versa?
Yeah, well, it's difficult. That's a great question. It's difficult for me to generalize because we just had that one example. Even though other researchers have documented it, we're learning more and more. We just had that one example of that really extreme. But in this case, the rut pretty much was the same. The timing is pretty much the same in that area of Louisiana and Mississippi.
Okay.
You talked about something really interesting to me about some deer seem to be homebody, some deer seem to be nomadic. And I think we've kind of experienced it in these places where it's more mountainous and they seem to be more nomadic than other places. And then there's other areas, say Southwest Oklahoma, that has a lot of bedding or a lot of bigger acreage properties with less pressure. What is there two distinct personality styles of nomads and homebodies, and how do you think age can somewhat influence that? Does that shrink a buck's home range? Is there any research around that?
Yeah, you got a lot packed in there. Let me deal with the age part first.
Yeah,
we see a little bit of a change, but it's not overwhelming, if that makes sense. As a buck gets older, maybe 10%, 15% or so, the home range will shrink a little bit. And there's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be individuals. But looking at population averages, it does get a little bit smaller, but not a whole bunch. Gosh, Christian, what was the first part?
Personality types between homebodies and nomads.
Yeah, we have it broken down into three different types. And we call them, the homebodies. And if you're old enough to remember the show Cheers, there was you're shaking me. there was this guy Norm, and the show was centered around a bar. So that was the whole storyline, was a bar. And there's this one guy named Norm, and every single day at 5:30, Norm would come in the bar. They would yell his name, Norm, and then he would sit at the exact same bar stool every single day for years and years. So we've seen that there are some bucks that are like Norm. They're pretty much is like once they get their home range after their yearling buck dispersal and set up, that's essentially where they're going to spend the rest of their life. They really don't change. And that's about a third of the bucks do that. Then we have these bucks that are on the other end of the continuum. They're like that explorer type, to where it might be before the rut, but their home range, when you plot the points on a map, it kind of looks like a dumbbell. And so there's a great big cluster of points here, and then miles away, there's another cluster of points, meaning there's no overlap whatsoever. They're very, very distinctly different. And then we have some that are kind of in between. They kind of shift their home range a little bit, but it's always kind of overlapping with what it was the month before, what it was the year before. It just overlaps and kind of moves around. So the footprint of that buck over its life can be really large, but you just don't see these big dramatic shifts from year to year.
That's interesting to me, because from a hunting perspective, it seems like you could utilize trail cameras to kind of learn the personality of a particular buck, right? Like if I get him half a mile over here, he's probably not or a mile over here, he's probably not a homebody, you know. Or if I get him, it just feels like you could somewhat narrow that down if you had a wide enough scope and a big enough area of land to kind of map it out.
And especially if you had collaboration from your neighbors. I know a lot of people don't want to share. Yeah, there you go. I understand. But yeah, if you had people and you would share data and can trust them and so forth, you know, you could figure it out. Yeah. Another thing I know a lot of very successful hunters are doing is once you figure out that you do have one of these, you know, bucks that shifts their home range or roams or whatever. And we talked about earlier how the timing is so interesting and how it's very similar from year to year. So Jake, you might be on a property where, you know, around the 1st of November, you know, we typically see this buck is use that for the next year. Meaning don't wait to discover the following November if that buck is back, because by the time the cameras are out and then you retrieve, you may be too late. It's anticipating that he probably, if he didn't get killed, he's probably going to be back, and he's probably going to be in that same area where you got photos of him the year before. So go ahead and get a setup ready for him.
On the first book he was talking about in 2016, it was kind of like a mix up of, or I guess a storage problem with the trail cam photos. Cause you know, once you put them in your phone, you just kind of screenshot them and then they're just there to show your buddies later. But I had one here 2 years ago. He was just a nice, we put him as 3 years old, but he was like a 120, 125. And you could just tell he was pretty young. You know, he had that shorter tines and stuff. But fast forward to this last year, around the same time, he would always, during the summer, he wouldn't be on my property, but which is fine. I'd rather have it this way anyways. But during the fall, he would, around late October, early November, he'd kind of shift towards mine. And that's when we would kind of pick up on him. And that's when we got the first pictures, of course. And that's kind of what I did this last year is what you said, set up to anticipate that. But me being the lousy shot I am, like that didn't work out. But no, I 100% agree with you.
I know we're taking very complex scientific research and we're kind of drilling it down to these very short segments. So I appreciate your willingness. You've talked about how you spent time at A&M Kingsville. Can you talk a little bit about the research we have on culling deer? Does it work? Does it not? What is this very complex study? I've actually spent a lot of time reading into this study. The National Deer Association did a great job posting about it. What can you tell us at a high level about that? If a hunter wanted to know, should I shoot this funky buck? Is he going to grow out of this? What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that because I literally got an email right before we got online here from one of the co-authors on the study, and he assigned me more work to do on the data analysis. So,
oh, nice.
When we get off the phone, I got to get back to work on that. Excuse me, off the podcast. Yeah, we can, and that's a good observation, Christian. In that, I mean, that is what we want to do with this research. For all the research we're talking about is we want to make it meaningful and understandable to hunters, landowners, practitioners, or you're not going to be able to use it. So that's always the goal, is to be able to reduce it and distill it down to make it meaningful and so you can use it. So here are kind of the take-home messages. Number one, no one could ever do a study like this except for in South Texas, in terms of the land area and the resources and the use of helicopters and all that sort of stuff. So to date, I don't think this study will ever be replicated, but because of the what we're going to go through, what we're going to talk about. But so the take home is that, yes, you can cull bucks, but it's all about the purpose for doing it. And so something that Steve and I, for example, we like to point out here in Mississippi and in the Southeast is that there is a correlation. And it doesn't matter if it's data from South Texas or Mississippi or wherever. It doesn't matter if it's data from deer pens or free-ranging deer. There is a correlation. There's a solid relationship between a buck's antler size when he is young and a buck's antler size when he is old. And what that simply means is that bucks with above average antlers when they're 1 or 2 generally have above average antlers when they get to be 4, 5, 6. Conversely, those that have below average antlers, and I don't like to say just as at the yearling age class, but once you get into 2 years of age, because there are so many other environmental factors that will influence a yearling buck's antler size. And the most obvious and simple one is when they were born. Bucks that are born relatively late are going to have below average just because they don't have the number of days or months to grow by the time they're a year and a half old. So if you want to remove those as for management, as a management buck, meaning that food is limited, and so because food is limited, I'm going to remove some of those, say, 3-year-old bucks that don't show promise to be a 140, 150, 160, something like that. Then absolutely, that is all just about food conservation and creating space. The difference here is if you're doing it from the perspective of thinking that you're going to influence population level genetics by culling some bucks, whether it's theoretical, whether it's with simulation models, stuff we've done here, and now on the ground with that big, 10 plus 13-year project in South Texas, they're showing that you can't do it. You just can't do it. And there's a lot of things going on there, reasons why. First of all, you've got dispersal is going on. So those yearling bucks are going to other properties. Bucks from other properties are coming here. So transfer of genetics are going on all over the place. You being able to assess, remember, if you're changing genetics, you're talking about offspring. And then you being able to assess, just because a buck has 150 or 160 inches of antler, that is no guarantee that his sons will. And so that term is called breeding value. Now, if you're in, if it's a deer breeding facility, just like with livestock, and you have pedigrees of all that, you can determine that. But when you just have literally a snapshot of there's a 150 class buck and I see it and shoot it, you have no idea what the quality of his offspring is going to be. And then also we fail to remember that what's the other half of the genetic equation? Mother.
Oh, yeah.
You have no insight whatsoever if that particular doe is going to have sons that are going to grow 160-inch antlers or 100-inch antlers. And so there are so many inefficiencies there, and that's why you cannot move the needle in a free-ranging context. But it does show you why you can do these you can really improve antler size in a confined environment where you have pedigrees. I mean, the deer breeding industry has shown that, they're producing 300-inch 2-year-olds.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
I mean, 200-inch yearlings I've seen. So, I mean, it is amazing how you can manipulate the genome when you have that type of breeding. When you can say this particular buck is going to be united with that particular doe, then you can do that. But that all falls apart in the wild. So the short answer, reduce all that down, Christian. The short answer is, in a free-ranging context, you're not going to do anything to improve the, quote, genetics of the deer herd. Genetics are related to antler size. And what that means is that you're going to go out and cull a few of these deer and expect the next year or 2 or 3 that the offspring of those deer are going to be bigger and bigger. And so you just can't do it. But that is not to say that management bucks cannot be part of management just for the reason of food conservation. And there are a lot of people that don't like that, and that is 100% fine. I mean, some of my colleagues are like, we just want all bucks to grow to maturity. Every buck we shoot is a mature buck. It doesn't matter if he has 80 inches of antler or 180. It's just shooting a mature buck, and that is absolutely fine too. Nothing wrong with it. So it just all depends on your objectives and constraints and what you want out of that deer population.
And it sounds like, I think in the broader hunting culture, there's kind of this issue with the term cull buck. It's like, I've shot a buck that was 7.5 one time, and it was super freaky. Probably wouldn't score 80 inches. And I'll be like, oh, people will say, oh, that's a cull buck. Yeah, it's actually this weird one on my hat here. A lot of people would deem that as a cull buck. And I'm like, well, this is a mature animal that I was very happy to wrap my tag around. I wouldn't call that a cull buck. In my mind, that was just a trophy, but people think anything that doesn't have high score is considered a cull. I just don't think it is.
I completely agree. And I've had some of the very bucks like you're describing that were some of the most meaningful, in my hunting career. I've got one of those spike on the side bucks where it's just a little fork on one side and just this would have been a beautiful 130-inch 8-pointer. Mm-hmm. But what was cool about him for me is that we had 3 years of photos of this buck. And same thing, Christian, nobody, that side's, messed up or broken or whatever, and nobody wanted him. But I was able to arrow a 6.5-year-old buck, an individual buck that like you, that had very unique antlers. And I loved that experience. But again, it's just really all about what you want out of your deer population. And there are some people, as you know, that are just 100% motivated by Boone and Crockett score. And I'm not judging it, not saying it's wrong, but if that's what you're interested in, then yeah, the buck like I killed, Christian, and the one you killed, they're not. That would be a call to them. Yeah,
that's very true. I want to take this culling scenario to like an extreme to kind of hammer home this point before we move on to the next one. So let's say a buck this is completely hypothetical, take it to the extreme of, let's say a 200-inch buck mates with a extremely poor genetic doe, was born way too late. Just her dad had her mom and dad's combination had terrible genetics passed on to her, and she mates with a 200-inch buck. There's a possibility in that scenario where a 200-inch buck and a doe with terrible genetics can produce a very small antlered offspring, right?
Certainly. Absolutely.
That's a good way to, I think, explain the point, because I think there's a lot of folks you could never convince that 200-inch buck is going to produce something that's going to be subpar in any way.
Yeah. When this study gets published, you were talking about the research going on in South Texas. There are going to be several examples of that where defining that breeding value number we were talking about, where you have this father that may be 160, 170 inches. And through genetics, because this is year after year, recapturing these deer and taking a tissue sample. So from that tissue sample, genetically, you can link up who was mother, who was father. And so they'll have plenty of examples to show you that exact point there of how this 160-inch father never produced a son that had antlers over, say, 130 inches. Conversely, there's a lot of examples of, here's this actually a little below average, 120-inch mature buck who had a great number of sons that were 130, 140, 150, et cetera. So it's this trying to predict what's going to happen. So there's variation in him and the father with this breeding value, and then you're linking it up with the mother, and you have no idea. Also, something else we haven't talked about is annual environmental influence. Now, it is the most extreme in South Texas and even into Oklahoma, not nearly as much in Mississippi. But year after year, because of fluctuations in rainfall, and with this research, we actually determined what proportion are switching. So if this particular buck was a cull this year, how likely is it to be, again, a cull the next year? And so you might have anywhere from 20 to 40% of the bucks it would have been classified as a cull this year. The very next year, because of rainfall, it's no longer a cull. Or one that was not a cull one year because of rainfall is designated as a cull the following year. So do you see how all this error upon error upon error, how this accumulates? to where when you start thinking it through, you think there's absolutely no way we're going to cause genetic change in this population from harvesting a few bucks. And that is precisely what the research is showing.
There's just too many variables to even wrap your mind around it. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
That's I love that stuff. Can you briefly, maybe like in a 60 seconds, talk about I believe in that study there was a 126-inch buck that had the highest breeding value out of any of the bucks tested. To me, that seemed like the silver bullet out of all this. That was like, that drives it home for me.
Your memory is better than mine. I remembered we called him a 120 class. I didn't know if he's 126 or whatever. And I'm sure that varied, year by year. But yeah, that was the champion in terms of his offspring having the greatest average antler size was this very, very regular 120-inch, 120 class buck. So yeah, it just goes to show you can't predict this stuff.
So I guess I'm not trying to stick too much further on this topic or whatever, but wasn't there a study of, it might have been on y'all's Deer Lab or something, but I remember listening to something where they basically pinned up 2 bucks, one on each side of a doe pin, and they cut off the antlers and made artificial antlers, and one, I think, a young buck and one an older buck. And could you talk a little bit about that? Because even if, let's say, you do believe in culling and you take those to the extremes, it's still up to the doe, kind of like we talked about before. Like, it's just so many variables where the human can't control anything. But would you mind touching on that just to kind of do it from the doe perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was one thing. Steve and I, for many, many years, we had talked about, does a doe prefer in any way? And thinking about this like a biologist would is a very big topic is what we call maternal care and maternal investment or parental investment. For example, in a lot of birds y'all are familiar with, the male and the female will eat. Of course, the female is going to lay the eggs, but the male will split incubation time. So we call that, they both have parental investment in that offspring. They're both contributing something to it. We think about with deer and a lot of mammals, the male, they're polygynous. So a male is going to breed a lot of different females. But we think about all the maternal investment mother has to make. Once she gets bred, she has got to carry this fetus, grow this fetus. After it's born, she's lactating. So she's investing her life. It's like, doesn't it make sense that she would, if she could, she would choose, an older buck and a buck with larger antlers, just because it at least would appear that this buck is a winner on kind of an ecological or evolutionary scale. He's lived long enough. He knows how to acquire secure resources, and he's a winner, so to speak. So we designed the experiment to where we had several does that we were able to chemically bring into estrus. So that was the key. We had to know that the doe is in estrus. And then opposing her, we manipulated the antler size of 2 different bucks. And so we wanted to isolate the age issue, and we wanted to isolate the body size issue. So we got bucks that were of similar age. So we weren't comparing a yearling to a mature buck. If one buck was 3, the other one was 3 or 4. Or if one was 5, the other one was 6, like that. And then what we did was then we cut off the antlers, and we worked with some great engineers on campus that developed a coupling where on the, what remained of the antlers on their head, we were able to fit this coupling on top of it. And we affixed either like a 80 or 90-inch set of antlers and a 160-inch set of antlers. And so that doe was in a pen in between those two. And what we just assessed was, where does she spend more time? So if she had a choice and the fence was not there, who would she avail herself to? And an overwhelming amount of time, it was always the buck with the larger antlers. And so But what's different about that is, remember, that was an experiment. That was something we manipulated. You got to think about now in the wild, what does that mean? Because anybody that's hunted, and especially hunted during the rut, you know, it's the buck is the buck that's chasing her, and the buck that is there when she is ready to breed is going to breed her. And if she's in standing heat and she's in estrus and she's ready to be bred, it doesn't matter if it's a yearling or a 7-year-old Boone and Crockett. I mean, she's going to stand there. But what we just demonstrated is that all things being equal, you know, if she had a choice, you know, she sidles up to or avails herself to that older buck with larger antlers. And then that leads into, well, does she play a role in mate choice whatsoever? And I think that's going to be another example in years to come, that maybe with GPS collars and some other type of instrumentation, we'll be able to figure that out better. What we do think may be going on, and I know there was a paper out of Auburn University that proposed this, and I agree. I think this is going on, is when that doe is coming into heat and standing heat, you know, that's only going to be for going to be an estrus, so to speak, for about 48 hours, meaning she's got the scent, sending the signal, but probably only receptive and standing for maybe only 6 to 8 hours. Can she travel and go somewhere where she knows that particular buck that she would be attracted to, that older buck? Can she go, I keep using the term, avail herself? Because remember, it's not active. She can't manipulate this. She just needs to be in the right place at the right time. And so might she be going to the home range of that older buck or the buck with the larger antlers? And another point we want to bring up with this is, we're not saying at all that as you increase antler size, like it's a continuum, that 180-inch buck would be more attractive than a 160-inch buck, and 160 would be more than a 140, because that wasn't the experiment. The experiment was antlers that looked representative of a 2-year-old buck versus antlers of a mature buck that is well above average, 160 inches. And given those two extreme choices, she chose the one with large antlers. And again, that just represents when, if you try to think like a deer, you know, we all do try to think about it, but antlers are a signal. You know, if you think about this evolutionarily, you know, they're a signal of quality. They're a signal of age. They're a signal that I'm not going through some type of disease. So it's not just like a genetics thing, but, you know, a doe can see a buck and instantaneously, if you see 130, 140, 150 inches of antler, instantaneously that doe knows that this is not an immature buck. This is not a 2-year-old. You know, this is an older buck. And that's really what we wanted to demonstrate, and I think we were successful.
What I took away from that is I'm going to put a big set, about 150-inch rack on my decoy and hope estrus does are like, that's the guy, which in turn will bring more bucks in, I hope.
That's right. In theory, it should work.
Cheating system.
So I did want to talk about something that I have very little knowledge on. I think Jake has very little knowledge on. It's kind of these are a couple buzzwords that I feel like there's not a lot of, there is information out there about it, but maybe not great information from a lot of sources. If you had to break it down on an actionable level for people, what do people need to be worried about for CWD and EHD? And what does that really have effect on the deer herd? What precautions do we need to take just from a pure hunting perspective? How should we think about this?
And from a Don Higgins standpoint, is CWD even real?
or a political disease?
I had a good conversation with Don about that recently, and we're all humans and we're all individuals, and we can agree to disagree. But you know, I know a lot of people think that, and certainly there is a political part to this. But to me, what I try to disentangle for myself and for others is what you do about CWD could be political, or you can have your opinions, or you might think that what the state is doing is extreme. you are entitled to your opinion about that. Absolutely. But what there should be no debate about is the disease real? And there's no question. I mean, there's no question about it whatsoever that the disease is real and it is killing deer. I think, and I'm going to, if I forget, remind me to loop EHD back into this, but I really believe that human beings have a hard time with long-term. Changing my behavior today for a different outcome a decade from now is really hard for us to do. And that's me included, and that's y'all included, and everyone. And the whole part about CWD that I think makes it a different beast to deal with is the chronic part of it. It takes a deer a long time to die from it. It might be a year, it might be 18 months, and it takes 5 years, a decade, 15 years before the prevalence rate grows to an extent. So I'm talking 30, 40, 50% before your typical hunter is going to be in the deer stand and go, man, I'm not seeing as many deer as we used to see. I'm not seeing as much tracks as we used to. I don't see the older bucks like we. That's the manifestation of CWD if it is allowed to just run amok. And I think that's very difficult. There was a great project this year at the Southeastern Deer Study Group, which is kind of the premier whitetail research conference. And there was a study conducted by the University of Georgia in Arkansas and in Northwest Arkansas. And one of the things they reported, the things they reported that were similar to other studies is that deer with CWD die quicker than deer that don't have CWD. Well, how do you know that? Well, you know that from when you capture these deer and you take a test. So you're able to take a test and say, currently the deer has CWD or not. And you put a mortality sensor on it, in this case, a collar, an ear tag, et cetera. And you follow them for months or for a year. And the difference is so stark that the mortality curves are completely different. And I'm going to generalize what I mean by that. Is when you start out capturing those deer, and what you'll notice is that the survival rate, so that means the proportion of deer over time, is that about 70 to 80% of the deer that did not have CWD or CWD was not detected in the deer, about 70 or 80% of them are alive a year later. Of course, you know, all of them don't live because deer die. Deer die by bullets, deer die by arrows, deer die by cars on EHD, you know, deer die. But when you look at the deer that had CWD 1 year later, and this has been shown in Wyoming in a study, I've seen this preliminary stuff in Wisconsin, they all say the same thing. Only about 30% of them are alive a year later. So CWD predisposes deer to death. They may not all die from CWD because you got to live about a year to 18 months before physical manifestation. Holes are created in the brain, and that's where you hear the zombie deer. Mm-hmm. That is the clinical CWD. It is going to die of. But remember, CWD facilitates all these other forms of death, like pneumonia. The very first deer that was found in Mississippi with CWD technically did not die of CWD. It died of pneumonia facilitated by, predisposed by CWD. Well, one thing these researchers always found that was very unique was, remember that severe cold snap we had over December? I believe it was over.
We were in Kansas. It was brutal.
Yeah, we're talking single digits. Well, a greater, I'm going to make sure I phrase this right. I don't remember if there were none that were CWD negative, but certainly a far, far significantly greater proportion of deer with CWD froze to death. How often do you hear about deer freezing to death in Arkansas?
Not often.
But there was a number of them with CWD that did freeze to death. So that's just what I mean by when a deer gets CWD, its body is going to fail it over time. We see that CWD positive deer are killed more often by hunters, for example. They just don't have their cognitive facilities about them, and so they make errors. They can more often be hit by cars, predisposed to other diseases like pneumonia. So I hope I didn't ramble too much there, but CWD is real. I think hunters have a problem with it because it's a long-term disease. And biologists in our state agencies are asking you to change your short-term behavior for this very, very chronic and long-term impact.
Yeah. So does anyone know like what causes CWD or like where ground zero, where it first originated from?
We think that the ground zero is in Colorado, and we think it was on it was a state/university research facility that was also doing sheep research, and sheep have their own version of CWD called scrapie, just like with mad cow disease is the bovine or cow version. So there's a lot of, when you look at ungulates, sheep, cows, goats, deer, that they all have this form of disease. What makes CWD so much different than like mad cow disease, best we know at this point in time, or at least to my knowledge, what made mad cow disease so different and how it could be managed and for the most part eliminated, at least eliminated on a large scale, it's not contagious. Cows weren't passing it from cow to cow to cow, but deer can pass it deer to deer to deer. And the tissue that can be shed externally that has the greatest proportion of the infectious agent, the infectious prion, is in saliva. And so that is the reason that state wildlife agencies want you to eliminate or usually prohibit supplemental feeding and baiting, is at least that's one thing that is in your control to at least minimize to some degree the spread.
So what, if we're thinking about deer as a resource, which I think we absolutely should, us as stewards of that resource, what can we do in the short term that maybe have a negative effect on us or maybe require more effort of us that is going to help in this long-term fight of CWD manifestation across the country?
That is, that's probably $1 million question right there. That's probably $1 billion question. What are the best management actions? And here's where the controversy comes in. But here's some things we know. Now, whether you agree with doing them or not, I guess that's up to you and your state wildlife agency to determine. We know that if you concentrate deer, you're going to increase the rate of spread. Now, what's difficult about this is deer are going to spread it anyway. So think of buck bachelor groups during the summer, and they're grooming each other. Deer are going to spread it to deer. A paper we just presented at that same conference, we were able to isolate in scrapes, both in the soil and the licking branch, infectious prions. So deer are going to spread it to other deer. But what a lot of these management actions that state agencies are taking is there a way that we can slow it down at least? And one of those ways is not to having these areas, these focal areas where we're concentrating deer like at a supplemental feeder. So not only are you getting deer in close proximity one to another, but you're actually, saliva is getting on the feed or feeder. And we know that saliva has the greatest proportion of the infectious prion in it. So that's one thing right there. Don't concentrate deer together. The other is deer density. And so almost every state agency is in the CWD management zone. They never say, stop shooting deer. That they encourage you to harvest deer, to keep the density lower, just so you're decreasing the rate of spread. Until we have like this Nobel Prize winning breakthrough and fingers and legs, toes, et cetera, across, that someone will come up with a breakthrough. And I hope it's in my lifetime. That's really all that's at our disposal right now.
So which one of these is the three-headed monster in the deer world? Is it CWD or is it EHD? I've seen a lot of EHD stuff on Jury Outdoors. I've seen a ton of their just monster bucks wiped out, it looks like, in mass proportions. Which one of these should we be worried about the most, or is it both? Well,
thank you for bringing that back to EHD, because I knew I was going to forget. I think, Christian, that really goes back to where I started, is you got to think about your deer resource in the short term or the long term. This coming fall, wherever you hunt, this coming fall, EHD potentially can be devastating for your deer herd in the short term. But the duration of it is going to be 1 year. And you could be really unlucky and have 2 years in a row. That rarely does that happen. But yeah, when you hear like the juries and a lot of other people report that a strain of EHD came through and they lost 30, 40, 50% of their bucks, that happens. There's no doubt about it. That happens. What is different about EHD, though, is that the disease cycle is broken at first frost. And so the insect, the midge or the gnat that is spreading that virus from deer to deer, once you have, that good killing frost, the disease cycle is over and you start over. Now, it may take a couple years for the deer herd to build back up, but once CWD becomes entrenched on your property, and I'm talking these 30, 40, 50% prevalence rates, it will never be the same for the rest of your life. Plain and simple. It's never going to be the same for the rest of your life. So as devastating as EHD can be in some areas, primarily the Midwest in the short term, I'll take EHD every day versus the alternative of having CWD on my property.
The Hunter's Advantage podcast is powered by Out on a Limb Manufacturing. Out on a Limb is a family-owned company based right here in Oklahoma that makes tree stands, saddle platforms, climbing sticks, and so much more.
Christian, I have a quick question.
What's that?
What bites down harder, a hippo or an alligator?
No idea.
It's a trick question. The Ridge Runner 2.0 bites harder than both of them. But all jokes aside, we use these products all across the land on public or private. These help us get into any tree we want and hunt where the deer actually are.
Most men go to the grocery store for their meat, but these products help you go to God's grocery store. I have used the Out on a Limb Ridge Runner 2.0 and the Shakar sticks for the last few years hunting public land bucks, and I've actually shot several bucks out of this setup. If you want to support the podcast and get some Out on a Limb equipment, make sure to go to outonalimbmfg.com and use code HNTA10 for 10% off at checkout. Once again, if you want to support the podcast, go to outonalimbmfg.com and use code HNTA10 at checkout for 10% off. Now let's get back to the podcast. Yeah, I had no idea that the EHD was a singular or a couple year period of time. I mean, yeah, that sounds like a lot better alternative than having it forever. Forever is that's a scary word in the deer world.
That's right. Well, think about this too, not to get too much in the weeds, but we all, since March of 2020, we've all heard a lot about viruses, right? We've all learned a little bit about viruses. Well, EHD is a virus. And believe it or not, in the southeastern U.S., so in Mississippi, Alabama, South Texas, Florida, they deal with EHD every single year. We have very, very trivial bouts of mortality. So every year, this coming fall, there will be a deer that dies of EHD in Mississippi. But because those deer are confronted with that virus year in, year out, year in, they build immunity. Does pass the immunity, the antibodies onto their fawns. And so you just have a few individual extreme cases where you can have a mortality event. But a big mortality event here might be 10%. I mean, that would be a really big mortality event. Now, go to the Midwest where they're not confronted with that virus year in, year out. When that novel virus makes it to that deer and they don't have the immunity, the antibodies, et cetera, they've never been exposed to it, there's a much more deadly outcome for a greater proportion of deer. And so that's why we see such a big difference, like in the Midwest, than you do in the Southeast.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Pivoting here to one that's completely different than viruses, what can you tell us about any research that's out there regarding how deer react to human pressure? So the importance of intrusion and staying out of bedding areas, properties where you're going to booger with the deer. What have you learned through maybe GPS collar research or just any other type of research about deer reaction to pressure?
Well, that was one thing. And we were literally just notified yesterday that our paper is going to be published. But that was the initial, when I was talking about buck 140 crossing the Mississippi River. Those were all tangential things we learned. The purpose of that research was to simultaneously monitor deer and hunters and hunting pressure. And there was not a very clear signal. So deer changed their behavior. That was what we documented. There's no question about deer change their behavior. So what do I mean by change their behavior? So with this type of study, and remember, you literally have, depending on the size of your data set, what period of time you're looking at like 800,000 points, GPS points. So you kind of have to generalize these averages. And the way we do that is look at, where are deer spending time, like before hunting season, at the beginning of hunting season, and then when the hunting pressure got really intense. And so they had these very distinct, X amount of their time was in bottomland hardwoods, X amount of their time was in food plots. And so it was very predictable and generalizable. All the deer kind of followed these patterns. But once preceding the rut, once really the hunting pressure started, all the patterns fell apart. And so there was no clear that a deer, once hunting pressure begins, a deer is going to move to this vegetation type. The pattern was that there was no pattern. And kind of the way I reconcile it or describe it is that bucks figure out where they can hunker down and be safe. And where buck A, goes to be safe might be completely different than what buck B does. But essentially within their home range, they're kind of figuring out, so to speak, where are these areas where I'm pressured the least amount. And that's where they're going to start spending more time.
So there's no conclusion on they go to this sort of cover, they go to that sort of cover. All we can distill from that is if you're intruding, you're leaving human sign or pressure, quote unquote, a deer is going to change what they're doing.
Yeah. And see, we had a really hard time. Well, it's very easy. So if I were doing a study with us three, I mean, I can get you to carry a GPS unit or get onto your iPhone or whatever. I can track where you go, just like we can track where the deer. That part is easy. It's that next level of what really is hunting pressure. And it doesn't have to be a gunshot. It doesn't have to be an event like that. So, I mean, Jake, it might be you cranking up your truck. It might be the four-wheeler. It might be a 12-hour-old scent trail, Jake, you might have left going to a stand or something. So the bottom line is that once deer season progresses and humans are all over that property, over that landscape, deer can sense it. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be that acute. Deer was coming down the trail, boom, they heard the shot, they saw the hunter in orange. It doesn't have to be that. It's a lot more subtle. At least that's the way we reconcile it. It's a lot more subtle than that. And so, but I am a big believer, and this is my, taking what we've learned, and then also working with and talking to other hunters and so forth. I'm absolutely a big believer that hunting pressure is going to impact deer behavior. I don't think there's any question about that. It's just, it's really hard to come up with a rule of, okay, X amount of, or how many times you can enter this or that or the other and come up with a rule that, and then all bucks are going to do this. Mm-hmm. What we found out is that they're going to behave differently. The one thing that was true is that the response by the bucks were completely different and individualistic. But the bottom line is, once hunting pressure was intense, they all changed. They all deviated from the pattern that they were doing before the hunting pressure.
So if you had to give advice to, let's say, a cousin that was going in his property 3 times a week to check his trail camera, to fill his feeder, what would that advice be when it comes to intrusion? Like, just stay out, or what would you say to him?
Do I like this cousin or not?
Yeah, you want him to kill a big buck.
I would treat checking trail cameras like I was hunting. I would have on boots, and I would play the wind with my getting in and getting out, and I would do it as infrequently as feasible. That would be my advice. That's what I've started doing.
You always hear those stories of those instances, like you bump a buck and he runs off and you just say, to heck with it, basically. And then you end up bumping him 2 more times and you're like, well, shoot, I should have sat there.
Yeah. You're right in that's difficult to measure, to measure that. It's one of those things where you, of course, would have to have real-time information. And even as sophisticated as these GPS instruments are that we have now, remember that there's always a lag time before we get the data. So I know where that buck has been, but I never know where that buck is at. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There might be a day or 2 or 3 before I can get the data. So I can see everywhere it's been, but right now I can't tell you where it's at. I can tell you where it's probably, based on history. So that's kind of difficult to measure. But Jake, this is just my opinion here. I think that would be very individualistic of the buck. Okay. I think some bucks could probably tolerate being bumped a lot more than others. You got to also think too, some of the I say stories like that has a connotation like I don't believe it, but you know what I mean? But stories people have, I bumped it, never saw it again. Well, that could also be a case of, like we were talking about, an excursion. That buck may not be on your property next week to begin with. It was just looping through during the pre-rut, and you jumped it and you think, well, because I bumped it, it did not come back. Well, it wasn't going to be back anyway. It was just doing a little 2-day loop, having to come through your property.
That makes sense.
Very difficult. So in other words, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, which I know that was a horribly pieced together question as it is, but I just didn't know from your perspective of it.
Probably some bucks that you bump them, and that's going to have a very detrimental effect on them. And there's probably, some bucks that you can bump 10 times. Mm-hmm. And the next afternoon at 4 o'clock, they're out on a food plot.
I think that's one of the things that keeps me coming back with deer hunting is one thing I've taken away from our conversation is the individual personality of each one of these deer. And it makes them so hard to hunt. Like, you never know. Is this deer going to be a nomad? Was he on an excursion? Was he chasing a duck? You never know. And so, like, putting these puzzle pieces together, even with all the research that we have and all the resources we have, it's still hard. And
that's right.
That keeps me coming back. That's awesome.
That's what makes it fun.
Yeah, for sure. I have a question for you. This is wrapping up here. And this one kind of is very interesting to me. So can you talk about the difference between northern whitetail genetics and southern whitetail genetics? Because I hunt in the southern portion of Oklahoma quite a bit, and I have some people that hunt near me, and then I'm kind of leased up some properties with that are completely convinced that we are hunting a different subspecies than maybe the deer in Kansas or the Midwest. Can you talk about the validity of the two different species, or if there is any at all?
So a little bit of history, and now you're getting into some real hardcore genetics. And I'll make a fool of myself if I even try to go down that road. But
you could lie to us, and we would just shake our head and be like, "You're right."
If you go back to the first, what we call the Deer Book, 1984, Whitetail Deer Biology and Management. It was like the big first scientific compendium of all this deer information. And you go in there and look at all the subspecies listed. I can't remember the exact number, but it's over 30.
Wow.
There are over 30 different subspecies of deer listed. But that was before genetics. And so everything way back in the day was based on phenotype, meaning what they look like. And so if a deer is a little bit smaller, if their coat is a little bit different, if the antler, on and on and on, is like, well, that's a different subspecies of deer. Well, then genetics came along. And when genetics came along, all that stuff fell away. And what we learned is that, deer are a product of their environment. And so their size, their shape, their body weight, their average antler size is 100% indicative of habitat quality, resource availability. So the way, I guess, Christian, I would say that is genetics right now can certainly discriminate that if you were to take a deer from Canada and turn it loose on your property in Oklahoma, and you were to take a genetic sample of the Oklahoma deer and a genetic sample of the Canadian deer, a geneticist could determine that this Canadian deer is an outlier. They would look at these particular markers and say, these are a little inconsistent. It's different than what we see on the average for this Oklahoma population. But other than that, I mean, we don't really think of, and remember, deer are dispersing everywhere. So we don't have like a Mason-Dixon line that deer don't cross, that these are genetically distinct. I mean, everywhere you go, there is overlap with deer, across state lines, et cetera. So a geneticist could discern that this particular deer is out of place. But believe it or not, in a couple of generations, that Canadian deer's offspring, after probably its grandchildren, for example, you probably could not discern that its grandfather was from Canada. That's how the genetics would just overlap and blend, et cetera.
That is really interesting, because I think the nugget I took away there is the deer being a product of their environment, because I was thinking of them as different strains, like, maybe there's a southern strain of deer in this portion of Oklahoma that I'm hunting, and that has something to do with the antler potential or the ceiling of how big their antlers can actually get. And what I'm kind of pieces that I'm putting together here is we have a lease in Oklahoma, southern portion, that has incredible age class. We've killed a 6.5-year-old deer, a 7.5, and a 7.5 the last couple of years. And what I'm realizing is the ceiling, the biggest buck out of those was 142 and was a 7.5-year-old buck, which is a great buck. But you would think that there would be even higher antler potential in that area. But what I'm realizing, the more I think about it, is water is a very, very limited resource there, and they get very little rain. And maybe that could be a bigger portion of the pie than the strain of deer or anything else. Maybe that's part of that deer being part of that environment.
Yeah, it could be. Of course, if it's limiting vegetation quality, for example, the abundance and the quality of one thing that rainfall and drought can do is it can and it can do a lot of things. But one thing that's real obvious that it does, it can reduce the protein content of forage. So when you're going through a severe drought, not only do the abundance of vegetation would be lower, but the quality of it is also affected by the drought. So that's one thing that can be going on. One thing, Christian, I would argue, I'm not familiar with your property, I don't have the data to look at, but here's something I see over and over and over again as well, is that you also have to think about, did the bucks that have above average antlers at 3 years of age, did they get shot, or were they allowed to get to 6.5? And the term we use in the South, because it's a forestry term, is high grading. Mm-hmm. From a forestry perspective, high grading means a logger or forester came in and took all the best timber out and left the lower quality timber. And so you go to that stand and you got all these mature trees, but a forester would say, but this stand's been high graded. All the really high quality, the white oak or the walnut or whatever, it's all been taken out. You have a lower quality stand. The exact same thing happens with the deer herd in terms of age structure and the proportion of bucks, that 10% or that 20% that we're going to grow to the 150s and 60s and 70s, those are still above average bucks at 3 years of age.
Yeah.
And so they get harvested as a 140 at 3 years of age. At 6 years of age, it could have been a 160 or 170, but they get shot early.
That's a good point. I think you go down a deep rabbit hole here too, because another angle that I think about that I've heard you talk about quite a bit is like the fetal programming aspect of it. Of if there's not this, if it's long periods of drought or terrible browse quality because of the no rain, maybe there's some programming from the does of like, hey, prioritize body size over antler because there's not much here for you to feed on.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the technical term is called epigenetics. It could also be like from a livestock perspective, fetal programming, but that basically the genome of a deer is a lot bigger, broader, and deeper than what you just see in an individual. And so this fetal programming is essentially what's going on is unbeknownst to the mom, but basically due to stress, environmental stress, particularly food resources, is that the expression of their genetics is influenced by the mother. And so if the mother is stressed nutritionally, what we've seen and others is that it's going to affect the genetic expression in her offspring. Meaning that if food is very limited in that environment, it is not advantageous for her son, her buck offspring, to grow to 250 pounds. Mm-hmm. It's going to die. It doesn't have the food to do that. So economize, have a smaller body. And, it may be more appropriate to have a live body weight of 170 pounds. In that environment, you can get the food resources for that. But that can certainly, that's like CWD though. That's a very long term.
Yeah.
That's what we call intergenerational nutrition. Sure. Intergenerational nutrition causes those effects.
So, Bronson, since we had John here, I know we talked a lot about the inner workings of whitetail, and I don't think it'd be a good hunting podcast unless we kind of threw a little bit of tactics in there as well. Are you familiar with the study from Dr. Mickey Hellickson? I think that's how you say it, in the Welder Wildlife Refuge, basically wondering if rattling actually works or not. And
it's a small world, guys. It's a small world. I was one of Mick's technicians.
It was kind of a loaded question. So.
You set me up. That's so funny too. Y'all were joking about me complaining really about moving this past week and how my body's still hurting from it. I actually found a tape, the old VHS tape, and I took a picture of it and sent it to Mick and said, here's that videotape that we took from the Welder Wildlife Refuge from that antler rattling experiment. So yeah, I remember that quite well.
Would you mind, I guess, kind of I know we're already an hour 20 into it. So just for the people who haven't heard of that study before, could you just give a brief overview of that and kind of, I guess, a brief result overview as well?
Yeah. There's a lot of little nuances, but here's, to me, this is the take home. And in terms of with me rattling, these are the things I remember. Number one, this is something you just, it seems so obvious, but it really matters. A buck can't respond to antler rattling if it doesn't hear antlers rattling. So the biggest effect we saw, and remember, we did all the little nuanced stuff, and I'm not throwing rocks at anybody that does this at all. If you have a ritual, if you have a way that you've been successful rattling, then by all means, keep doing it. But we did the every little thing where you start tickling them a little bit, and you start out with hitting some brush a little bit. The bottom line is that when we would rattle so long and so hard, you were physically given out. I mean, but and we timed it. I think we had I remember 3 minutes. I think that was a long sequence. Maybe the short sequence was a minute or a minute and a half. But by the end of that 3 minutes, and it was called LL, long and loud. And so we had you rattle short and quiet, or short and loud, and then long and loud. And if you drew the straw that you did the long and loud, you couldn't hold anything in your hands. So you are literally, think of gripping a baseball bat, how much force that is the way you're grabbing those antlers and just clanging and beating. And that is what drew in the most bucks. And it's just the simple physics of it. The louder you are, the greater, calling card, the greater aerial extent you have for the most bucks to hear it. And then from that, you have a sample. You have some of the bucks that hear it are not going to do anything. They're going to twitch an ear and go back to feeding or bedding or whatever. But then there's going to be a fraction of those that are going to be charged up and come running in. So you increase your odds of getting a response the more bucks that you hear. We also saw a greater response, it makes sense, during the pre-rut than during the rut. During the pre-rut, bucks are roaming. Not as many of them have successfully found a doe and are locked in and are tending. So yeah, the greater access, more of them are available to come. And then once the rut hit, you still got a response, but a buck's not going to leave an estrus doe to go chasing after, antler rattling. So that was really it. If I'm going and I'm going to rattle, and I do, is the greatest odds are do it in the pre-rut and be as loud as you can with the antlers.
Now, was there a certain time within that study that, because I think you all did it like in the morning, like I think mid-afternoon, and then in the evening, was one of those 2 or 3 better for rattling?
Jake, I'm getting old, and some of those details are fading away. I remember that it was either morning or afternoon, but I remember both of those were very similar. I don't think there was a great disparity. It was certainly better, though, than midday. And again, it just kind of comes out that, the more bucks are active and that are roaming around and moving, the greater, the odds are he's going to hear it and respond. And one thing I distinctly remember, and that's saying something, because we did that study like in 1993 and 94, and I still remember this to this day, is one particular buck. I was doing the rattling, and I could see this buck, believe it or not, and it's a different landscape. Remember, that's more of a plains kind of open, but he was probably 400 yards away. And so probably barely at the limits of when he could even hear, but as long as I was rattling. So for that 3 minute sequence, and he was not one of these that came charging in like some did, but when I started rattling, he would pick his head up, look that way, and started walking, just a very decided, measured, a buck walk, how they do. But as soon as the sequence was over, that 3 minutes, and I'm trying to recuperate and rest my arm, he completely forgot about it and went back to browsing, started doing. And then when the time came back up and rattle again, he would come. And then when you stop rattling, he would fade away again. So
you're literally pulling him in on a string.
Yeah. Yeah.
So did y'all see any type of bucks getting scared from the rattling sequences at all? Because I listened to this, where I heard it was on y'all's Deer Lab, but this was, I don't know, it was last summer probably when I heard it. And that's one question that stuck in my mind, because I don't think y'all covered, obviously y'all covered the benefits, but was there any like downsides of rattling that you could see?
The only downside that I could see or remember seeing was that, of course, you had some instances where the rattling worked so good that they came in and got so close that they sensed you were there. They smelled you or saw you and knew the gig was up, and they ran off. If that had been a hunting situation, though, and not a experiment, the buck would have been dead.
All right. Okay.
But yeah, we definitely disturbed, scared some deer because they got so close.
Well, that didn't really seem like too much of a con, I guess, then, huh? Well, so to kind of wrap things up, I try to ask every guest this, but even though you are literally the definition of a deer expert, and no matter how much you know about deer or how much you think you know about deer, they always seem to somewhat outsmart people, right? So in your experience, now this can be an encounter, a shot opportunity, or whatever it may be, what's that one moment that just keeps you up at night in a hunting related scenario that we basically labeled it as what's your close but no cigar?
This is one thing I think about all the time, and I can't do anything about it, but it just rattles around up here, is from that buck movement study we've talked about a bunch. We looked at daily home ranges. And so you all have heard this stuff for years and years and years about an annual home range. And for a deer, whether it's including the rut or not including, it's going to be square mile is a very good metric. During the rut, it might be 1,000 acres, 12. But we started looking at what do they cover in a day? So again, thinking about from a hunter perspective, a day, and what was remarkably similar across all the age classes, all the bucks we had, which we had about 60 different bucks. What was remarkably consistent was day in, day out during the hunting season, a buck covers in terms of, if you, all the little locations and you draw a circle around it, what's that area? About 200 acres. About 200 acres. And so what I try to think about is if I know a buck is in a general area, so part of a property, a 300-acre area or whatever, it's like, why would he be in this little 200-acre area? And, the next day he's going to be about 200 acres over, so it's always these little 200-acre patches he's moving throughout the landscape. And trying to figure out why that is and what's going on. And I can't figure that out.
Sounds like you need a rifle.
Yeah.
That's funny. So Bronson, if you could just close in here, wrapping up with this, if you could implement one golden rule of management across, and every hunter in the country that hunt whitetail have to adhere to Bronson's rule, what would that one rule be that you think would make a great impact on the deer herd across the country?
I don't know if this is a good answer, but it's something that does stick in my craw. And those that are around me have probably heard me say this. The one thing, and I do think it would make a difference. Deer aren't targets for your amusement. And I think every time you take a shot, you have a very, very ethical duty to make sure that that it's an ethical shot, and you have a very, very high probability of killing the animal without losing it, with the least amount of suffering. Something I really despise, and you've all heard this kind of thing, is I got a new rifle or a new scope, and, especially with the long distance stuff going on now, and, I'm all for that if you can do it ethically, but, trying to set a personal record of shooting a deer, for example, at 500 yards, stuff like that. I respect, I guess, deer more than thinking of it as a bullseye and as a target. And if I miss it and gut shoot it, oh well. And if you've hunted long enough, you've seen this too, where a deer just goes running by with half of its mandible missing, because someone tried to take a headshot, probably so they could brag about taking a headshot, and they were 3 inches low and shot it right in the jawbone. Or a deer go running by and one of the legs is dangling. Now, everybody's going to have if you do it long enough, you're going to have a bad shot. And I'm not, but I really don't like it when people treat deer as kind of a personal record target. I think you really disrespect hunting and you disrespect the animal when you do that.
I think that's a great point. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and decades worth of research with us today. We really appreciate it. We want to send some of our audience your way. So where can people get connected with you personally, consume some of the MSU Deer Lab's content and research? Where's a great place for them to do that?
Well, I think we have a format for all age groups. And what I mean by that is we produce a lot of media. If you like reading articles, if you go to our website, msudeerlab.com, we've got a link on there for publications and most everything we've written, popular articles. You can go there, download it, print it, etc. If you want to listen to a podcast like this, you can go to Deer University. And it's a couple of deer nerds, me and Steve Damaris, and interviewing guests, and we're talking deer biology and management, just like we're talking about today. And then we're on social media as well. So if you look up the MSU Deer Lab on Facebook or Instagram, we even have a YouTube channel. We're really trying to get media out there. So MSU Deer Lab TV. So whether you like to watch videos, listen to people talk, or do it the old-fashioned way and read articles, we hopefully have some media for you.
Awesome. Well, you guys go check that out if you're listening or watching our podcast. And Bronson, thank you again for jumping on with us.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. It was great meeting you two.
Thank you guys so much for checking out the Hunter's Advantage podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to the podcast. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you in the next episode.